A very warm welcome to you all this afternoon. We, Engender and the Scottish Women's Budget Group, are delighted to welcome so many of you today to this event, Where Does the Money Go? Exploring the role of gender budget analysis in preventing women's poverty and violence against women and girls. My name is Jade Stein. I'm the Comms and Engagement Manager with Engender. Today's event is using the Zoom webinar function, which means that you can see and hear us, but we can't see and hear you. But please do feel free to use the Q&A function and drop your questions in there throughout the event as we go. You can also share your thoughts on the event to our social media channels, and you can email Engender to info@engender.org.uk and the Scottish Women's Budget Group info@swbg.org.uk. I'm delighted now to pass over to Engender's Policy Officer for our work on delivering equally safe, Hannah Brisbane. Hannah, over to you.
Thanks, Jade. Good afternoon, everyone. Just bear with me while I share my screen. Perfect. There we are. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon at this Challenge Poverty Week webinar that we're hosting in partnership with Scottish Women's Budget Group. As Jade said, my name's Hannah and I work on Engender's Delivering Equally Safe project, which, in case you haven't heard of before, is contributing towards the delivery of Scotland's National Violence Against Women strategy, which is called Equally Safe. So I'm just going to kick us off this afternoon with a quick overview about what our project focuses on and the importance of challenging women's inequality and poverty in order to prevent violence against women and girls. We'll then hear from Heather Williams, who is a training coordinator at the Scottish Women's Budget Group, and she'll be explaining more about what gender budget analysis is, before we then hear from Mariam Ahmed from Amina, the Muslim Women's Resource Centre, about the cost to women when this analysis is not applied, with a focus on BME women and Muslim women in Scotland. So to start off, I just want to take a moment to define what is meant by the term violence against women and girls, or VAWG. So this term refers to any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual or psychological harm or suffering to women. And this also includes threats of violence, coercion or restrictions on women's liberty. And this definition is applicable to public life as well as when we're in private. And as you can see, within the Scottish Government's understanding, this violence can take many different forms, such as domestic abuse, sexual harassment, and so-called honour-based abuse, just to name a few. These are different forms of violence that are predominantly carried out by men and directed at women and girls because of their gender. This isn't to say that men don't experience these forms of violence, but rather to bring attention to the fact that women are disproportionately affected by it. Unfortunately, this violence continues to be endemic in Scotland and the UK, and you need only look back at the past few weeks in the news to confirm that statement. But this is also just a small selection of some of the available data on the prevalence of VAWG in Scotland, which also backs up this notion. It's also worth noting, though, that this is a massively underreported issue, so these stats likely vastly underestimate the true scale of the problem. Nevertheless, what the available data here does tell us is that this violence continues to occur, and that it's having lasting and disproportionate impacts physically and psychologically on women and girls in Scotland. And we also need to be mindful that successive crises like austerity, COVID-19 and the cost of living crisis have exacerbated violence against women and girls as well. So the reason we wanted to highlight the issue of violence against women and girls during Challenge Poverty Week is because of the link between women's inequality and this violence. So it's pretty widely accepted that this inequality is the root cause of violence against women and girls. And at the same time, violence against women and girls creates and upholds this inequality because of the way this violence can impact the lives of women and girls and their families, their health, their job opportunities, their communities, and so on. So being at this webinar today, I'm sure you're very aware that unfortunately gender inequality is still pervasive in Scotland. This inequality manifests itself in many different ways, whether it's women's increased risk of poverty, the gender pay gap, women's unequal access to adequate incomes, the overrepresentation of men in positions of power, or even harmful and stereotypical portrayals of women in our media. And all of these different facets of women's inequality and discrimination are contributing to an environment in Scotland where violence against women and girls is being enabled and tolerated. So Engender's DES project is focused on preventing and ultimately eradicating this violence by tackling this root cause of gender inequality. And this is different from early intervention or harm reduction responses to violence against women and girls, because they deal with violence once it's already happened. And to reiterate, primary prevention's aim is to stop this violence from occurring in the first place. And in the current Equally Safe strategy, which again is Scotland's strategy for preventing and eradicating violence against women and girls, the Scottish Government and COSLA describe primary prevention as being a core objective and recognise that achieving this approach will require us to change societal attitudes, values and structures which produce gender inequality. And in line with this ambition, there have been a few different initiatives, campaigns and programmes which have aimed to support this approach. However, there's remained since the inception of Equally Safe a critical gap in the way that primary prevention is being embedded into our public policies, particularly those that sit out with the justice and equalities domains. And this is a pretty significant gap because of the way that public policy affects pretty much almost every area of our lives. Therefore, it's vital that public policies do all that they can to promote the principles of equality, safety and respect across the different domains and ultimately contribute to a Scotland that is hostile to violence against women and girls occurring. So one example of a policy that is incompatible with a primary prevention approach and is very relevant to our discussion about challenging women's poverty is universal credit. So social security is a deeply gendered issue because women are at a greater risk of poverty and are more reliant on social security than men because of structural inequality in our society. But universal credit reinforces this gender inequality by upholding the outdated male breadwinner, female carer model with harmful design features like single household payments, for example. So this means that just one person within households, and usually the man, will have more control over the income and finances. And indeed, research has linked the current system of universal credit to putting women at a greater risk of financial abuse and engaging in survival sex, while also undermining a woman's ability to leave an abusive partner. And this diagram just shows how universal credit is upholding this relationship that exists between the women's structural inequality with men, rather than doing anything to disrupt this kind of cyclical relationship here between that inequality and violence against women and girls. And although responsibility for universal credit largely lies with Westminster, this demonstrates the complexity of achieving the Scottish Government's primary prevention objective, and also the need for a really strong leadership and positive collaboration within the devolved context to achieve this approach across different areas of public policy. And the Scottish Government has been exploring the feasibility of introducing single and split household payments for some years now. And this really needs to be made a priority as part of this primary prevention approach as well. So that's the aim of Engender's Delivering Equally Safe project, is to support policymakers to integrate primary prevention into their work, no matter the area of public policy that they are responsible for. And with the help with some of our partners across Scotland's women's sector, we've started identifying opportunities that can really drive this approach in policymaking in Scotland. And included within these recommendations is for the Scottish Government to use gender analysis and improve the use of that analysis throughout the policymaking process. And the aim of this recommendation is to ensure that policymakers understand the gendered impacts of the policies that they are developing and take action to avoid any adverse consequences on women's equality and safety. And so gender budget analysis is a tool that can support this approach by inviting policymakers to really understand how spending decisions and budget allocations will affect women and different groups of women. It can also help reveal any gaps and biases that will perpetuate gender inequality and ultimately increase the risk of violence against women and girls to occur. And so this analysis can then influence public spending and revenue raising decisions to ensure that they're really driving equality, tackling poverty, and ultimately eradicating violence against women and girls. So ultimately what we need is policies and services that are working to support women's equality and tackle women's poverty if we are to eradicate violence against women and girls from Scotland once and for all. So I'll pass over to Heather now from the Scottish Women's Budget Group to explain more about what gender budget analysis is and the importance of applying it. But please feel free to pop any questions about this, our Delivering Equally Safe project into the Q&A function, or you can also get in touch with me directly via my email address on the screen here too.
Thanks, Hannah. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is a quick overview of what gender budgeting is and how that can be used as a way of reducing inequalities. So ultimately, the core purpose of gender budgeting is to change policies, programmes and resource allocation so that they promote gender equality. Gender budgeting is a way of critically analysing decisions that are taken about the way in which we raise money and the way in which we spend money. And it looks at the biases that can arise because a person is male or female, and at the same time takes that intersectional approach and considers the disadvantage that can be experienced as a result of ethnicity, class of poverty, age, disability. And it looks at how those norms and stereotypes and expectations that are prevalent across society impact on the opportunities and choices that individuals have. In Scotland, women's inequality is still an issue, and it impacts at all points in women's lives. And gender budgeting is a way of making it visible, particularly making the impact of unpaid care and the responsibility for care and caring visible within the policy making process, and particularly thinking about how the way in which services are delivered and the way in which resources are raised, how they impact on different groups. So I think it's worthwhile saying that gender budgeting is not a special budget for women. Sometimes people think it is. It doesn't even necessarily focus on spending aimed at women. As I said, it's a tool for bringing about change. It's a way of critically reviewing how budgetary allocations affect the economic and social opportunities of women and men, and it seeks to restructure revenue and spending decisions to eliminate unequal outcomes, while understanding the context in which those differences arise. So understanding how those stereotypes, norms and expectations impact on men and women, and how it impacts on the way in which we live our lives, and how that impacts on things like employment and earnings and responsibilities for unpaid care. And ultimately, we would argue that gender budgeting is just good. It's just good budgeting. It's not about 50% male or 50% female, because 50-50, while equal, isn't always equitable. Gender budgeting is about determining where the needs of men and women are the same and where they differ. And where needs are different, it's about allocating resources differently. Ultimately, gender budgeting is about asking the question, who benefits and who doesn't? And as I say, it's a process of making visible those the impact of those expectations, stereotypes and norms that we have in society. That means that men and women often lead different lives, and that they don't enjoy equal rights and opportunities, and that means that their experiences and needs and priorities are different. So we know that there are differences between men and women in relation to employment and earnings. Women are more likely to experience poverty at all points in their lives. They're more likely to be in low-paid, undervalued work. They're more likely to work part-time, all of which impacts on their income. And because of that, they potentially are more likely to be in receipt of benefits. Women tend to rely on benefits, whether they're in work or out of work, paid work. And the way in which women use public services are different as well. So when there are changes to those, when there are cuts to those, they tend to, it impacts more on women. And a lot of that comes back to the obligations for unpaid care work, which predominantly falls on women. And because of these differences, the impact of policy and spending decisions will be different. And those differences mean that policies which may appear neutral on the surface can have unintended consequences, including increasing gender inequality. And Hannah's given an example there in relation to universal credit. But another one within the UK, which is a useful one to consider, is around access to, our access to benefits and our access to pensions. On the face of it, the fact that that's predicated on a full-time employment over a period of over a lifetime seems like that would impact everybody the same, because we all have to work the same level of time and to pay into the system to take out of the system. However, because of the fact that because of those unpaid caring responsibilities that often fall on women are more likely to work part-time. They're more likely to take career breaks to cover caring responsibilities. And all of that means is that policy, which on the face of it looks like it affects everyone the same and which is neutral, actually disadvantages women and means that they're more likely to experience poverty in retirement. So gendered budgeting is a way of making sure that policies which appear gender neutral on the surface, that those unintended consequences can be identified. So it's a way of critically analysing budgets that allow us to take into account the impact of those norms and expectations, in particular considering how responsibilities for unpaid care impacts. Now, the principles of gendered budgeting and the tools associated with this can help us to consider the impact of decisions taken about how we raise money and how we spend money. And gendered budgeting aims to make the process and outcomes from policy making and budget setting more transparent, more equitable, and more participatory. And gendered budgeting is about bringing strategic planning and public finances closer together. So it's about it's performance and results orientated. It's about recognising what we want to achieve and how the way in which money's raised and the way in which money's spent helps to achieve that. It is about taking an intersectional approach, so it's about looking at the different things, which different characteristics that can cause inequality, and how does that intersect, and how does that how does policies impact on those things. Wherever possible, we want to take a lifetime approach. So we want to think about how the decisions that we take now, what does that mean for people when they get to retirement? And most importantly, we want to take account of the effects on the unpaid care economy, because decisions that we take which impact on the need for individuals to work or people's ability to access paid care will have a knock-on impact in terms of the level of unpaid care that's required and who carries that unpaid care out, because those care needs don't disappear. And ultimately, it's about making sure that we value care. For too long, care is seen as the mantra around care is that it's a drain on our economy, but actually care work drives the economy, and it's about making that visible. And another principle of gendered budgeting is about quantifying the differences wherever possible. Too often when policies are being looked at and through impact assessment processes, we see people saying, oh, this won't have any differential impact on these groups. And that's because they often a lack of data. Gender budgeting is about recognising the context in which we live and the context within which those norms and expectations create, and recognising that because of those differences, that there will likely be a difference in impact, and we assume that there will be that until we have the evidence or the data to show that there's not, whereas at the moment we very much take a different approach to that. And in relation to thinking about the way in which gendered budgeting can be used, and it can help us to shine a light on the unintended consequences of policies. So since 2010, austerity has been a factor in the UK, and it's been a decision made by governments, by Westminster government, which has been passed to the Scottish government, which has then been passed to public authorities in Scotland. What we've said there is that austerity is a triple whammy for women. and it disproportionately impacts women who are carers, who are disabled, women from Black and minority ethnic communities, and lone parents. So there are certain groups that are impacted even more by austerity. And there's a number of reasons for that. So when we take a gender budget and approach, it allows us to see the damage that austerity has done for women and girls and other disadvantaged groups in the UK. And part of that is because of the erosion of wages. So in the public sector and the third sector, workers for a number of years have faced a pay freeze throughout the 2010s, and they are now facing the impact of rising inflation that's come about at the end of, after we'd come out of the lockdowns associated with COVID, and the increase that's come around utility prices as a result of the war in Ukraine, and how that is driving the inflation that we're experiencing at the moment, and that cost of living crisis. So it's impacting on the levels of disposable income, and many are struggling to survive, particularly women who even at the start of before austerity typically had lower levels of wealth and lower levels of income. As it stands within the UK, 40% of people on universal credit are in paid work because they're not earning enough to survive, and the austerity has played into that. The austerity policies of the past 13 years have eroded social security, and women are more vulnerable to poverty due to lower incomes and wealth because they're more likely to have a disability or caring responsibilities. And that leaves them more reliant on social security and public services. And it means that they're hit harder when public services and social security are cut. Analysis by the Women's Budget Group shows that cuts to social security between 2010 and 2020 amounted to savings of £37 billion a year. And their analysis shows that women's income was hit twice as hard as men, with lone mothers losing the highest amount of income, and women disabled women or women who have disabled children, and women from Black and minority ethnic communities also being particularly harmed by this. And given some of the noises that are coming from the Chancellor, it suggests that the government intend to make further changes which will economically negatively impact on women. In terms of another example of where that kind of gender blind policy making impacts negatively on women around particular social security. Last year in September, Kwasi Kwarteng announced changes to the conditionality rules in relation to universal credit, which meant for you to be classed as being working enough, basically. So they raised the hours that somebody needed to work per week to not have to have a job coach. And we know that through the analysis carried out by the DWP that has hit those who are already disadvantaged and struggling worse. So women, especially mothers, and those with caring duties, disabled people, and some Black and minority ethnic groups are often in part-time or lower paid work, so are more likely to face these requirements. They're also at higher risk of underemployment and insecure jobs. And the DWP's analysis shows that most in-work universal credit claimants likely to be brought under the in-work conditionality will be women. So 77% of those who will be affected will be women, 70% will be parents, and over half are expected to be lone parents, and nearly 1/3 will be disabled or limited by have a long-term health condition. So taking a gender blind approach can have a real negative impact on women. So in terms of austerity and the impact on public services, as they struggle to survive and there are cuts, fewer people can afford the support they need, and women are disproportionately relied upon as carers of last resort or taking on additional work to make up for cuts in services. Research carried out by the Urban Big Data Centre and North Lanarkshire Council highlighted what they call the third shift carried out by women, and helping to maintain their communities by taking on work that would previously have been routinely undertaken by council employees when cuts and changes were made to environmental services across North Lanarkshire. They were able to use data from the customer services to show that it was disproportionately women who were reporting problems and were taking action to address problems in their community. And they've likened that to a third shift that women end up taking. So austerity harms women. It impacts every facet of women's lives. Policies that disregard the needs of women reduce already inadequate services that they rely on, and deprioritise their safety and well-being can exacerbate other forms of oppression and violence that women already face. And ultimately, austerity and the decisions that have been taken make women more vulnerable. It creates those conducive conditions in which violence against women can happen. So through taking a gendered budgeting approach, if governments do that, obviously austerity shows that it's not something that has been taken in relation to these decisions that have been made. It can highlight these consequences, and it can help us to address inequalities. We know that kind of austerity, that women become the shock absorbers of poverty, often sacrificing their careers and security by leaving work to take on unpaid care and make sacrifices such as skipping meals so their children can eat. So when times are tough, they take on that additional emotional and mental labour of finding ways to make ends meet. And gender budgeting approaches allow us to build this into the policy and decision-making framework, and to recognise how decisions that are being taken about the way in which we raise money and the way in which we spend money can impact. As I say, that's a very quick rundown of what gender budgeting can do, but happy to take questions at the end. Hannah, I think I'm passing back to you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Heather. And yeah, good reminder that there will be time for questions at the end, so do put in any questions into the Q&A box. But I'll now pass over to Mariam from Amina, the Muslim Women's Resource Centre, to hear more about the kind of impact on when these different spending decisions are taken without this analysis, and the disproportionate impact that is having on BME and Muslim women in Scotland as well. So over to you, Mariam.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm the Chief Executive of a national women's rights organisation called Amina. We have the National Helpline. We also deliver a financial advocacy and employability service within Scotland for predominantly BME and Muslim women. And yeah, today's discussion is we do have a big focus on violence against women as well, and we support a lot of women. We have an IDA service. I'm an IDA in my previous years also. But really today's webinar for myself, I was going to put up slides, but I thought just to talk to yourselves about the kind of demographic and the issues that we come across with a lot of women that come into Amina. Now, what I would like to say is that at least over 50% of Bangladeshi community in the UK live in poverty even before the cost of living crisis, and about 46% of the Pakistani community live in poverty in the UK, and again this was before the cost of living crisis. About over half the callers that we have are from the Pakistani and Bangladeshi community. So already when we have women accessing support from Amina, they're already coming from a very disadvantaged background. And there's also, I know that the previous speaker, Heather, had spoken a lot about intersectionality, and it's really important to remember that the women that we support are affected by different disadvantages, multiple forms of disadvantage, whether that's disability, their ethnicity, immigration status, discriminated against because of their religion. So there's and their race is a big one. So there's multiple forms of discrimination that women are already coming to Amina with. and also at the same time, they're experiencing much higher levels of poverty. And as we know, not adopting a primary prevention approach will only affect, and majority of the times will be affecting, women. And we know that the drivers for inequality are things like poverty. And again, I've already touched on how poverty already impacts many BME women in Scotland. What I would say is that Hannah had actually mentioned about universal credit. And it's really hard not to get really, really frustrated as a women's rights organisation regarding universal credit. I remember when universal credit was first introduced, and it feels like it was many, many years ago. And the first thing that many women's rights groups had picked up was the application of the credit was completely incorrect, at the fact that only one person, if they were doing a joint claim, would get all the money. All the money amalgamated together would go to either the male, but usually it could be the male or the man or the woman. But usually what we found was that all the money was going to the male partner. And, you know, as women's rights groups, and I have to mention this is really frustrating, because I'm now thinking about the number of years we've been going on about this. And yes, it's very difficult. And yes, you can split the payments apparently. But I think as a risk analysis and working in domestic abuse, it actually causes more questions for women, because a lot of abusive partners would say, well, why is the money being split? But again, the cost of that and understanding how that impacted women pre-pandemic was absolutely immense. And, you know, the fact that we've gone on for so many years without that change happening is quite worrying. What I also kind of want to touch on, and this is kind of really a very pressing issue, for somebody like myself. Now, for Amina, we work with a lot of asylum seekers and refugees. We have all BME women, migrant women approaching Amina for our help. We have what's called a hardship fund. We didn't have any choice but to set up this fund. It was a complete 100% community donation fund. And that was because we were coming across so many women with such high levels of poverty. And the hardship fund was a way of ourselves saying to women, okay, we will hopefully try and be able to help you. And we adopted what's called the cash first approach. Now, just to kind of give everyone a bit of a taste of the volume of applications that come through, just within 6 months, we've had over 52 applications to the hardship fund. We've only managed to pay out 32 of those applicants, and we've paid out a region of £3,205 already within 6 months. Now, bearing in mind, these are community donations. This is not something that we're funded to. So the actual application of giving out the hardship fund is quite high. Now, what we find is that the people that are accessing the hardship fund, there's two types. One is violence against women experiencing domestic abuse and are wanting to flee from abuse. Leaving is an expensive job, you know, and staying either in an economically abusive relationship or leaving that relationship, you kind of do need that financial support. And as we know, that support isn't always available for women straight away. So there's a lot of things. It's really hard for women to leave with children, sometimes just with the clothes on their back. And in many times, you know, looking at our lovely Scottish weather today, I'm sure where many of the people are joining this webinar, it is raining outside. But, you know, a lot of women, and this is the time of year, will need jackets, will need shoes, will need appropriate winter clothes. And that's kind of one of the works that we have to do is that when a woman is fleeing abuse, they kind of need that help. But then what's also being created and what we're dealing with in our organisation, and this is particular to migrant women, we definitely have what's called a two-tier support system. And it's something that's very unfortunate within Scotland. And what I mean by a two-tier support system is that if you're born in the UK, that doesn't mean that you're going to be afforded not being, I suppose, subject to poverty. But if you are experiencing abuse within the UK and you are an asylum seeking woman, then you're in a lot of trouble, especially if you are in a relationship and you're still wanting to leave. What we're finding is that with our hardship fund, and this has been a really, really hard decision, we've had to make the decision that we cannot help every single woman who is coming from the asylum seeking community. Now, majority of the women that come to Amina and approach us for our help are staying in hotels. And yes, their situation is absolutely horrific. But what we find is that when we help one woman in a hotel, it becomes a bit of a opening the Pandora's box. You know, there'll be several women from that same hotel saying, we know that you've helped so-and-so, can you help us also? And that can be a very, very difficult situation because, again, we've only got limited amount of money. So for us, it's about how can we sustain helping not only BME women in general within Scotland that are dealing with higher levels of poverty, but how can we actually sustain all the asylum-seeking refugee community, and especially women that are coming to us in such vulnerable circumstances. And again, we know things like primary prevention, housing inequalities is there. Well, there isn't a bigger housing inequality when you've maybe been staying in a hotel for over a year, and those circumstances are still happening. Unfortunately, they're not being recorded. So when it comes to looking at the actual poverty levels that we're dealing with, they're quite serious. And it feels many times that we're firefighting with the situation that we're in. We have asylum seekers sometimes is dropping in, you know, and we're not a drop-in service. We're very much, we have caseworkers that can help women experiencing domestic abuse, but we don't actually have what's called a drop-in service. And a lot of the times when women are coming to our doors and they're dropping in, it's because they're just in desperate need, not always experiencing domestic abuse. They've maybe fled by then, but they're just in desperate need for clothes, for food, but for cash. You know, so sometimes the money that they're getting is just not enough. And what they don't need is a food bank, because a lot of the times the food banks that are available for a lot of asylum seeking communities, the food is not suitable for them. And what I mean by that is I am more than happy to stay on a diet of chips and roll and chips, nice and cheap. You can go to the chippy, you can get one for like £1.50, £2, but a lot of women from our communities maybe don't understand that kind of food. You know, for them, their diet is more about lentils, it's about rice. So for them, like looking at things like cheese and bread or whatever, it's just not something that they identify with. And also the need for religious specific foods like halal food. So again, sometimes it's left to us to try and source not only food for them. There might be a food bank next door, but that food bank isn't actually suitable because of the food that is providing is things like pasta. And again, if you're staying in a hotel, you don't actually have any cooking facilities. So those are the kind of issues that we kind of come across for a lot of women just in that kind of level of poverty. Really what we want to think about is dignity for women. You know, how do we have that stigma of being in that level of poverty, but especially when you're pushed into that level of poverty because you're experiencing abuse, you are experiencing domestic abuse, you've left, you don't have all your belongings, you don't have any money, and on top of that, you've got no recourse to public funds, and you're staying in a hotel with no cooking facilities and no money to buy a new jacket. So those kind of things are really difficult. So when we say, why doesn't she just leave? I know it's the usual, but women are definitely pushed in to going back to their perpetrators. We had a case just about 2 weeks ago, and a woman who was in such high risk of domestic abuse. However, she was going to have to claim asylum and stay in a hotel, but the chances of her asylum claim being accepted were so low. So we're finding women are actually staying in abusive relationships, or going back to abusive relationships, even although they're crying to us saying we really don't want to, but we have to, because there is absolutely no other choice within the immigration system. And with the new illegal migration bill, it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get more difficult for women just staying in those abusive relationships. So how are we ever going to empower women out of that kind of level of abuse, and especially the poverty that's already created with immigration control. Now, there are kind of things that we are doing within our community that isn't just, I suppose, hardship fund and firefighting. What we do have in Amina is an employability service. And what we do with that is we have a worker who will actually work with women to actually upskill them. And what we find is that the best way to get a lot of these kind of women out of poverty and really to empower them to make better life decisions is to actually educate, you know, and be that kind of safe space, that special service that can do that for women. And what we do have is our employability service. We have digital literacy classes, we have English learning classes, we will help women write CVs. And that kind of work is, I think, really underestimated at how important it is for women to have that help. We also used to have a housing clinic on our helpline. And again, that's something that is really important. And one of the biggest drivers, I would say, you know, in primary prevention is housing. If you can get a woman a good and safe housing, she's more likely to stay out of that abusive relationship. But again, when you're staying in a hotel, and I mean, I know that a lot of people who've never been to these refuge hotels would think a hotel sounds quite nice, but they're not the kind of Premier Inns. Even a Premier Inn would be a lot better. These hotels are horrific forms of, I suppose, accommodation. They really do, I would say, is completely against anyone's human rights for a lot of children and women to be staying in that level of situation. So I think for me, just another thing that I do want to mention is the work that, you know, Amina are trying to do to get women out of poverty. We are working with the Women's Budget Group as well. And what we're meaning to do is a series of workshops looking at gender budgeting. And it's called Women Make Glasgow. We're going to be doing a series of looking at what caring responsibilities look like for a lot of women, and speaking to them about what their transport costs might be, what pay, looking at gender, looking at the gender pay gap, and actually just speaking to BME women about what are their needs. So again, if we go in and say gender budgeting, a lot of the times they'd be like, well, what does that mean? And I think Heather did a fantastic job of actually explaining what gender budgeting is. But what we really do need to do is work with the primary prevention focus and work within women's groups. So like I said, the work that we're doing with the Women's Budget Group really does help women explore conversations around what is the cost of caring, explore conversations around transport, what's the cost of transport, you know, what do you feel like your needs are when it comes to safety in transport. And again, as we know, there's a lot of women that won't actually use for example, public transport at night time. You know, one of the things that in Glasgow, there was a low emission zone. And as much as I was for that, I do think there's certain decisions that were made in enforcing something like the low emission zone to think, well, what was that impact on women? There's a lot of women that have said to me, actually, I can't go into town. I don't feel safe on public transport. And if you think about if you're a BME woman that wears a scarf, sometimes their danger can be a lot more. And again, we're wanting to really kind of get women out of that kind of poverty situation, but it is very, very difficult. Unfortunately, it has just got harder. Funding pots are a lot more restrictive. And again, our hardship fund continues to be oversubscribed. We cannot keep up with the level of women or the volume of women that are needing help, to the point that organisations like Amina are saying, can we actually continue to help women that are staying in hotels that are asylum seekers? And it's a very, very difficult decision to make, because again, we do not know where else we can actually get any. There is no kind of funding to help that level of cash first approach. So that's kind of all from me. Thank you everyone for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions on that.
Hi Mariam, thank you so much. I'm Yve Barry from the Scottish Women's Budget Group, and I'll be chairing the Q&A section. So we've got a couple of questions already, but please put more questions in if you have them. Our speakers would really appreciate that. The first question we have, and I'll direct this to Heather first, but any other speaker can come in if you like. How do you reflect on the Scottish Government's adoption of gender budgeting, and are our parliamentary committees thinking about this as part of their pre-budget scrutiny? So over to you, Heather.
Okay, short answer. So we were invited to give evidence to the Equalities and Human Rights Committee last week, which was looking at gender budgeting and human rights budgeting. And one of the pre-questions that they gave was how is this being implemented? And I think the reality is it's not routinely being implemented at a Scottish government, nor at a local government or a Westminster level in the UK. There are pockets of good practice or where there are individuals who have who are taking this on board and who are interested and are looking at it, but there is no coherence basically in relation to how gender budgeting is being implemented on a routine basis. And that's at any level of government. I think there's lots of openness and there's lots of goodwill towards trying to do this, but there is definitely a lack of policy coherence in relation to this and a lot of kind of silos, which I think impacts on work in this area. And for those of you that might have seen it, the Scottish Government published a letter today from the Minister around the review of the public sector equality duties, and there's no mention of gender budgeting in that, despite the fact that that was consulted upon as being something that they were looking to do. So to be honest, that's quite disappointing that there's nothing, or at least on a quick look at that, there's nothing mentioned about that. So there's lots of good words, but in terms of practice, I think there's still a way to go. Sorry, that's quite negative, but that's kind of where I am today, I have to say.
Unless anyone else wants to come in, I'll ask the other question. So this is kind of open to all speakers, so please chip in when you want. How can we balance the shortfall felt by women who have received carers allowance but now receive a reduced amount because they have reached pension age? Responsibilities have not changed just because they have reached retirement age, and indeed income is highly likely to have reduced following transition to retirement. So anyone can pick up on that if you'd like.
Knows the importance of what we're talking about, gender analysis throughout the policy process, and also making sure that our policy making processes are more inclusive so that experiences like what's detailed in the question are actually taken into consideration by policymakers, and that kind of opportunity for reflecting on the impact of these policies is starting at a much earlier process than is the case at the moment. So even for the previous question, when we're talking about what's happening now within the government, a lot of that reflecting on the impact of different policies is happening once policies are already in place, and we need that to be happening much earlier. And I think, again, this question really speaks to the importance of that happening in our process, and that really links into that primary prevention idea of applying the principles of primary prevention, equality, safety, respect throughout the policy making process to achieve equality, rather than trying to retrospectively fit things into existing structures and policies as well.
I think that's also an example, Julie, of the fact that care is often invisible, and it's just assumed that it's something that women will do, and it's an example of the fact that we don't value care, and that's something that has to fundamentally change. That all of us will need care at some point in our life, whether it's we've had it as children, or as we age and as our health changes, we're all going to need some kind of care. But that seems to be completely forgotten about, and also, in terms of that stereotype that's just, women do it naturally and therefore it's not valued. So it's about, gender budget, and those approaches are very much about bringing care, and particularly unpaid care, into the centre of those decision making processes, so that it becomes visible. We talk about within GDP terms that people are economically inactive. Nobody is economically inactive. If you're buying things, you're part of the economy, but when you're not in paid work, you're termed as being economically inactive, and therefore you're invisible. So gender budgeting is very much about making care and unpaid care visible, and it's so important that we do that.
Can I just come in with that as well? I think it's really important until these kind of policies and these kind of issues are taken into account. The only other organisations, it's really going to be the third sector that picks up the slack for what the work that the government should be doing. So when you've got women in that kind of situation, it probably be food banks and third sector organisations that will be kind of going into overdrive to try and help meet that shortfall. You know, I was kind of at a Poverty Alliance meeting today, and somebody was kind of mentioning a lot of kind of health related issues that a lot of like women who are from an older generation are now suffering from: malnutrition, rickets, God knows what else. And I'm thinking, oh my God, but really it's going to be that stress on third sector organisations who are already underfunded. So really, when you're kind of looking at, yes, we're wanting the government to push for gender budgeting, and they can do that, but they still need to put, I think, more money into women's services and trying to actually help a lot more women out of the kind of society inequalities that they face.
Great, thank you. And we've got two questions about the Human Rights Bill, so I'll try and mash them together for all of you. So someone's asked, how could the implementation of a new Human Rights Bill for Scotland support women across Scotland, and seeing any positive way forward for the Human Rights Bill and budgets allocated to the work that groups like Amina do? So if anyone wants to pick up on that.
I'm really keen to see how, I think we're all kind of keen to see how this Human Rights Bill in Scotland will play out. And I mean, to be honest, when it comes to a lot of refugee and asylum seeking women, from what I understand, even with the adoption of like the Istanbul Convention or CEDAW, that is still going to exclude a lot of asylum seeking and refugee women. So for that, I really don't know how that's really going to benefit, or any of the kind of human rights approaches are going to benefit a lot of our clients. And although I would say that the Scottish Government's approach to immigration is a lot different, and the language is a lot different to the kind of hostile languages that you get from Westminster, unfortunately, it's not a devolved issue. So I would say that although Scotland are amazing in the fact that we're wanting to go ahead with this Human Rights Bill, there's still going to be a lot of limitations there, just because of the devolved powers. Again, I think, am I right in saying that the Human Rights Bill will have the right to like safe environments or whatever? So we are hoping to see how that will play out for a lot of women. And again, I'm hoping that, yeah, that will bring, you know, a better focus on human rights for a lot of the communities in Scotland.
Yeah, I think in terms of creating that human rights culture in Scotland, the Human Rights Bill is a really important opportunity to contribute towards that and maybe strengthen some of our existing equalities duties, and we'll see if it introduces any new ones. The consultation is closing this week on what the government is proposing, so Engender's response will be published at some point in the coming days. I think ultimately though what we'll be saying is we need to see more detail in terms of our ability to actually determine the impact that the bill will have on women's rights in Scotland, and that's something we're just not ready to make a determination on it at the moment with what's in the actual consultation paper just now.
And I think similarly, Hannah, for us, the consultation paper does mention human rights budgeting, but what does that actually look like? And we would argue, we'd contend that, you know, that even with human rights budgeting, you would still need to take a gendered lens to that. So gendered budgeting will still be important. So I think, you know, like lots of organisations, I think the jury's out on what this human rights bill will actually mean in practice. I suppose for me, one of the pieces of legislation that we work or we use at the moment within the work that we do is the public sector equality duty, and from the Equality Act. And if we look at how public bodies actually use that, and how they're held accountable for their use of that, I suppose I'm probably a bit, we have the legislation, but once the legislation's passed, it's about how it is actually implemented. And I think that's one of the issues that we have in Scotland, not just in Scotland, but we have as an implementation gap, is that we have very good intentions, but actually how things work in practice don't necessarily lead to the differences that we want for different communities across Scotland, unfortunately.
Thank you all. We don't have any other questions, so if you want to quickly put one in the chat, then please do. I'm probably going to put the speakers on the spot here, but I just thought of one more question. If there was one thing that you would like the attendees to take away today, each of you, and what would that be? I know it's a wee bit on the spot, but yeah, anyone can chip in anytime.
Well, the drum that I've been banging a lot recently is rather, basically often when we talk in the decision-making forum or policy-making forum or decisions around how money's raised and money's spent, is you have the decision, you have the financial decision, and then you have equalities out there. For me, what we need to do is we need to make sure that equalities and the information we know about who is most disadvantaged in our community, that is driving the decision, rather than making the decision and then look at what that means for equalities groups. So use your equalities data and use the information you know about who's disadvantaged and have them at the heart of what you do, would be my plea, please.
Mine would be that people from disadvantaged communities and people facing the highest levels of inequalities are usually the ones that are completely invisible in society, and it's really important for third sectors. And especially ones that work within poverty. We've got so many Poverty Alliance, financially included, the Scottish Women's Budget Group, Engender. It's really important that these organisations continue to do their work, but also continue to be the voice for people with lived experience of what they're going through, because without these kind of organisations highlighting the high levels of poverty, and especially with women experiencing poverty, I don't think anything would be done. So we need to keep banging that drum, and we need to keep going on about it, because the cost of living crisis is not over. And women in general, even before the cost of living crisis, were already in many financial crises. So things are still not over. It's important for all us as organisations to work together. And I think there's some great work happening. And I think we just need to continue to be a good partnership together and share our learning.
I think for me, just highlighting again, particularly in the context of Engender's DES project, that the root cause of violence against women and girls is gender inequality. And if we're not tackling that as an issue, we'll not be able to prevent and ultimately eradicate this from Scotland. So just having that understanding of the relationship between violence and inequality is so important, and understanding that this violence is not just a justice issue. It can't just sit within a justice directorate. It's kind of everyone's responsibility to be challenging this inequality and that violence as well.
Great, thanks. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot. Just one quick question before we end. This is for you, Heather, from Pamela. She says, as a disabled woman, I've been waiting on human rights for us to change for decades. How can we make sure that it actually happens? Big one for you.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Mariam was saying there about, women are often invisible in policy making, but that is doubly so for disabled women. It's even more so for women from Black and minority ethnic communities. So we need to keep on we need to keep on banging our drums. I keep getting, I sometimes doing training, I talk about, I'm banging on about things, and it's like, oh, that's it's only how women say, but we need to keep banging that drum. We need to keep making it that policymakers and people who make decisions can't ignore us, and that and collectively we need to be doing that. That's I think there are lots of opportunities for things to change, but we need to hold people accountable for the decisions that they are making, and make those who are most disadvantaged in our communities visible, as Mariam was saying, and that takes all of us doing that.
Great, thank you. So there's one more question. I know, it's okay. So yeah, we'll just close now so we don't run over time for everyone. A big thank you to all of those of you attended. We really appreciate how many of you have come along today, and also a big thank you to all the speakers. It's been an enlightening discussion and webinar today. You can check out all the organisations on their respective websites and all the work they're doing. And make sure to head over to Challenge Poverty Week page on the Poverty Alliance website. There are many more events this week you can tune into and look at more detail for their policy asks for today's theme on adequate incomes, which is a particular focus on a minimum income guarantee. I hope you've come away with more understanding about the impact of austerity on women's access to adequate incomes, along with the impact of this inequality to women's experience of violence. Thank you, everyone.